Grief is ugly. It's not as simple as a linear 5-stage process that everyone talks about. Grief isn't something that can be tracked through a timeline. It's complicated as our feelings can spiral out of control. Grief can even create an empty shell of ourselves, flipping rationality into madness. And in Invincible, we see that through Scott Duvall, or Powerplex. The story of Powerplex in Invincible's 3rd season stands out in this series as one of the best narratively focused episodes. Its original narrative in the comics was a spin on the typical villain of the week trope to show how villains are made, not born. But the show goes beyond and emphasizes how the guilt and pain from trauma linger and manifest into delusion, recklessness, and self-destruction. The show even displays how the same tragedy continues to impact Mark and his growth as Invincible. Mark acts as a perfect foil to Powerplex as both are dealing with the guilt from the same accident in different but unhealthy ways. Yet when they come together, they learn different lessons by the end. In this video, I'll discuss how grief can distort the truth through the tragedy of Powerplex. Before we get started here, I'm gonna just let y'all know it's spoilers for the whole show, not the comics though, so I'll give you a few seconds to click off and watch. In the meantime, if you end up sticking around anyways, it'd be nice if you guys liked the video or subscribe. It'd be cool if you did. I think you'd be cool if you did. Alright, that's enough time. Let's first establish who Scott was before his downfall. Before becoming Powerplex, Scott was pretty much an average Joe, a well-intentioned family man who had powers but never intended to use them beyond a simple magic trick for his close ones. But just in a single moment, Scott's life changed. Scott walked away from his family, and in an instant it was ripped away from him. To Scott, he didn't see Invincible fighting to protect humanity. Scott saw Invincible hold his family's limbs. He believed that Invincible and Omni-Man murdered his family and flew away, scot-free. Scott survived, and now he has to deal with the guilt of living. One thing was clear in our villain-to-be's mind: justice. But Scott's idea of justice wasn't really justice. It was just an excuse for retribution. Scott lost his family, a loss so unbearable that he needed his pain to be validated, a loss so unbearable that someone is to blame. Scott needed a punching bag, and Mark was right there. Scott's path to justice, if you can call it that, didn't lead to self-destruction immediately. He tried building a case with a lawyer to seek justice through law, but that didn't work. He tried working as a GTA researcher to find the truth, but he didn't get that either. He wanted to gain closure and seek justice, but even then it wasn't even a problem with the system. Scott's idea of justice was obsessive that if anyone told him he was wrong, he'd maintain his delusions. Scott was told that Invincible is only another victim in the chaos. Invincible is the only person capable of saving humanity from people like Omni-Man. And Invincible was the hero. Yet Scott's response was just one big nuh-uh. If no one saw it like he did, then he had to take measures himself. Someone had to seek vengeance against Invincible. Someone had to show the world how much of a monster Invincible really is, and that someone had to be him.
I want the truth! I want justice! I want...
Well, if you're familiar with revenge stories by now, you know for a good amount of them that revenge usually doesn't bode well for the person seeking vengeance, with the typical lesson that revenge will consume you and all that. Revenge stories in Invincible aren't that much different. It's a matter of execution, and the strength of Powerplex's story lies in how Scott repeats in the same cycle of vengeance. He ends up getting hurt from his own actions every time. When Scott first appeared to the world as Powerplex, he took the typical leap of faith that appears often in superhero media. The leap of faith usually signifies the beginning of a journey, heading into a situation blind, but having enough faith to succeed. In Scott's case, he took a leap of faith that began his transformation as Powerplex. Powerplex's first appearance was confounded by recklessness, as seen by his leap of faith and how his lightning powers work. His whole power is to absorb kinetic energy to lightning, but Scott turned a power he used as a magic trick into a power where he has to keep hurting himself to hurt others. Scott lacked the experience to control his powers because he never utilized them violently before. For him to be strong enough to take down Invincible, Scott would have to get hurt often. Scott's powers are the embodiment of the pain he takes, but to him, he could never feel as much pain as losing his sister and niece that day. In Scott's first fight, he only wanted to fight Invincible and no one else. Scott didn't mean to hurt others, but people can't see intentions. People can only see what's right in front of them. And the people see a delusional weirdo running loose in the city, man. Scott wanted to prove to the world that Invincible is dangerous to validate his pain, but as soon as he slips up even a little, everyone sees him as a monster in the same way Scott sees Invincible. But is Scott wrong for seeking validation for his pain? Is he wrong for wanting justice? Not necessarily. Scott's call for justice is not inherently wrong because Mark is kind of a problematic superhero. Where it falls apart is the motivation behind it. Scott was fueled by grief, which clouded his judgment. This obsession with justice was to prove that his family didn't die for nothing. It's human to feel that our lives should mean something, to find value in our existence, but even when our loved ones are gone, their life should be just as valuable. Scott's family meant something. Scott was right to bring more attention to the lives lost in Chicago for the sake of justice, except that's not what it was truly about. Scott ran away from his guilt, projected his pain onto Invincible, and grew into the very thing he despised. Honestly, the most tragic part of Powerplex's downfall is that he could have stopped at any point. His plans were constantly being foiled, and he was close to giving up on getting his so-called justice, except his wife was present, enabling every act. Becky was indeed mentally unwell too, but she took advantage of Scott's mental well-being for her vendetta. Bro, Becky let their son get tied up by Scott. I'm crying. At this point, I've been talking about Powerplex, but the meat of the episode for me is how the story all comes together into Mark's character arc. A recurring theme of this episode is dealing with the existence of multiple truths. For Scott, he was dealing with the truth of his family dying and distorted that truth to find someone to blame. For Mark, it was dealing with the multiple truths of what his father was and the legacy that Mark has to leave as Invincible. His talk with Eve and Oliver sets up Mark's character arc in the episode, which involves him reliving the guilt of the fight with his dad. Mark loved Nolan and idolized him that he wanted to be just like him. Oliver too feels the same way, but he never learned how that love could fall apart like his brother. Both could reminisce on the good truths of Nolan's character, but Mark was the one that had to deal with the truths that the same man killed the original Guardians and killed so many more. There's no denying that Nolan did save more people than he killed. On Earth at least. I'm just saying on Earth, okay? Bro probably killed more before Mark was born. Since then, Mark has been serving penance to save lives and kept blaming himself for what happened. Mark's whole character arc in Season 2 was trying to deny the expectations that people had of him, being another problem like Omni-Man was, and proving to the people that he's more than just that. Mark was trying to show the people his truth. People were able to see that truth and understand it was never Mark's fault. However, how Mark dealt with the trauma made him neglect other heroic responsibilities. Mark was still reckless and never took the time to assess the damage he's caused. To be fair, Cecil did kind of shut him out of this information and he was never really told about this, so he can't be fully blamed. Mark did a lot as Invincible, but will it ever be enough? Does saving more lives make up for the ones lost? At this point, Mark suppressed the trauma of fighting with Omni-Man and the damage done to the city. I'm pretty sure we don't see Mark connect with the victims because he was busy dealing with his own trauma. Mark shut himself away from the world as Invincible. Scott appearing in Chicago opened Mark's eyes up to what it meant to be a hero again. Both Scott and Mark shared that they've grieved from the same incident, but each handled it differently. Scott's grief manifested into delusion, and Mark's grief manifested into neglect. After seeing of what became of Scott, Mark knew he had to save whatever he could, leading into the final conflict with each other in this episode. In Powerplex's and Invincible's conflict, it's not a clash of ideals. It's the fact that these two ideals are disconnected from one another, that they're too deep to turn back. What stood out between Mark and Scott's final fight in the episode was when Scott told Mark,
Why do you get to live when so many others died? What makes you so special?
Scott was literally projecting his trauma onto Mark because he was the one left standing. A combination of Scott's survivor's guilt, obsession, and delusions have led up to this moment against Mark. Nothing else mattered to Scott at the moment than to get justice for the deaths of his sister and niece. Yet, when Scott finally got the chance to lash out his pain, he ended up hurting everything around him, even killing what family he had left. Scott ended up back in the same position he was before. His family's dead, he's all alone. Scott was so caught up in his own delusions that he neglected what was right in front of him, and now it's all gone. If he killed Invincible, he'll believe that he's gotten redemption for the deaths of his family, but really, Scott just couldn't handle the gravity of his family's deaths. For Mark, he failed to save Scott and his family twice now. Mark was too late to mend the situation with the victims that led to the creation of Powerplex, and now failed to save Becky and Jack from the villain he created. The unhealthy ways that Mark and Scott coped with their trauma both led to failing the people around them. Both have to live with the facts. Mark failed as a superhero, and Scott lost the only family he had left, but it's a matter of whether they accept to live with the facts or not. Mark accepted the truth. Mark acknowledged he became bad at saving the lives he could, and just like the title of the episode, all Mark can say is sorry and do better with Powerplex serving as a lesson. Whereas Scott, once again, runs away from the truth. Scott has nothing left but his obsession. Whatever support he had is gone. He's doomed to continue his vicious cycle of grief, blaming Invincible for his own actions until he chooses to accept the truth. Considering this series of events, I think the show does the story justice compared to the comics. It's a much tighter narrative to explore Mark's growth as a hero and Scott's descent with his distorted justice. I know some people don't like this episode because Scott essentially created this self-destructive path for himself, but that's what made it so enticing. Not every character acts logically, especially when they're as troubled as Scott. Grief can drive even the most rational person insane, but grief isn't something to run from. Grief isn't something to be replaced by something even more harmful. Even though the linear 5-stage process can't properly describe grief, it's a start in how we feel. As humans, we don't stay on one stage. We tend to jump back and forth depending on the situation and how we tackle grief itself. Sometimes grief is just something we have to accept. Even though it will hurt, avoiding it will hurt even more and affect those we love. The tragedy of Powerplex is an important lesson for Mark, as it shows that Mark still has much more to learn. Anyways, that is all I have to say about Powerplex. I really hope you enjoyed the analysis. I really like this season of Invincible, and I do want to talk about this story more often on this channel. If you want to talk about how delusional Powerplex is, go ahead and talk about it in the comments. Also, feel free to like and subscribe. I promise to do more Invincible and One Piece content in the future, so stay tuned if you like that. Anyways, I'm about to head out, so I guess stand chopper. Woo!